Les, welcome to our podcast, Ideas in Action. Today we have Les Young, Managing Director and Principal Consultant at Astute Machinery. Les, can you please tell us about how did Astute started? What is the background?
Well, Astute started 6 years ago. I was working with one of the corporate providers of what we do. Got a little bit disillusioned and decided to step out on my own. One of the guys who I was working with at the time, he came with me very quickly after that. And we cover the full range of machinery services. Background-wise, I got into it not necessarily from the moral and ethical point of view. I sort of ended up in it to a certain extent. But previous to AMC, a few years ago, I spent 17, 18 years working on medical life support equipment, keeping people alive in hospitals and things. And when I got the opportunity, it sounds a bit corny, but I thought, okay, I've helped fix people in the past. Now I'd like to try and stop people getting injured in the first place. So that was how I got into it, essentially. It's really enjoyable. It's a very satisfying role, not just being the boss, as the guys call me, tongue in cheek. But it's we get a lot of satisfaction for what we do. All the guys in the team, and there'll be 6 of us by the time we get to the start of May, they all have a vested interest in doing what we do. Nearly all of us have investigated industrial accidents before. One of my colleagues has actually lost a very good friend in an industrial accident, so he's 100% involved with what we do, and he does it with a passion, kind of thing. But it's a very satisfying role, and we've got a really good bunch of guys in the team, all exceptionally well qualified, multidisciplined guys from electrical engineering, mechanical engineering. Myself and one of the other guys are trained formally trained in accident investigation. We've got people hydraulically trained, pneumatically trained to European level. And outside of that, things like confined space management were qualified and all that kind of sort of ancillary issues to what goes on around a machine. Because what the approach we take is we don't just look at the machine, because that's fairly easy to do. It's prescriptive. But we take a wider approach. We look at what's going on around the machine. I've got the machine in place. Have I got trip hazards? Where's the nearest fire escape? So we try to give a holistic approach to a machine, and it's quite satisfying. And the clients we've got really acknowledge the standard and the quality level of work that we do for them in that.
That's great. So before we dive into the wonderful world of machinery safety and compliance, just for our wider audience, can you give us the definition of machinery in the context of regulation and industrial kind of applications?
Yep, there is a formal definition of machine, and I'll give it to you. But when you think about it, it applies to just about everything that moves.
Okay.
And it's a series of components which are joined together that move in a specific action to perform a task that are powered by something other than animal or human effort. So your washing machine, your video recorder are effectively machines. That's why it's called a washing machine. But that's retail, domestic.
Yeah.
You go into industrial, then you go into industrial robots. You get into undersea saws, which we looked at one not too long ago up in Aberdeen. So the definition of machine is a very wide scope. It catches an awful lot of products.
So you're trying to, as a company, your mission is to save people and asset from anything that machinery can cause.
Pretty much, yeah. That's
apart
what we're
from
about.
doing its function in the intended function.
Yeah, there is a saying in our world that there's no such thing as a safe machine.
Okay.
The safest machine in the world is the one that's still in its crate, which is parked in the middle of a car park. But it's not, because somebody will walk into the crate in the dark because they don't know it's there. So there's no such thing as a safe machine, and we take the same approach with robots. There's no such thing as a safe robot. In recent years, collaborative robots have come on the scene. And a lot of manufacturers in the early days were selling them as like, oh, it's totally safe, nobody can get hurt or damage them. But it really depends what you put in the end effector. Yeah. You can limit its movement and limit its force, but if if you put a sharp knife in its end effector, it's still got the potential to damage somebody. So you should always do a risk assessment on any robot you install, be it an industrial one or a collaborative one.
And what are the key regulations, would you say, that drives or sets the standards and best practices to ensure that companies, whether they are suppliers or end users, are complying with
So from a supplier's point of view, when it does roll down to the end users and system integrators, as well as the machinery directive, which is in the process of being replaced by the new machinery regulation. That's at European level. You can use the machinery regulation at the moment, but the formal guidance from the European Union hasn't come out. But it will completely replace the machinery directive in January 2027. So there's some changes going on there. There's also the EMC directive, electromagnetic compatibility directive, and the low voltage directive. They have UK equivalents. So in the UK, you have the UK Supply Machinery Regulations, which is the same as the Machinery Directive. They were all brought into UK law in their own way when we were part of the European Union. But even now we're out of the European Union, the UK versions still apply. But in terms of CE marking, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of UKCA marking, which was going to take over from CE, once we left the EU. That's back on the table because the UK government wanted to do their own thing with the UKCA mark. But they eventually saw the light that they should have saw right at the start, to be honest. And they continue to allow CE marking as an acceptable thing. That the requirements of those directives roll on down to system integrators, and then they do roll on down to end users as well. So, from a UK perspective, you're then tied with things like the Health and Safety at Work Act, the Provision Use of Work regulations, which most people know as PURE. So the assessments we do give the legally required assessments under the Health and Safety at Work Act and PURE and the Machinery Directive. Because there is an onus on the machine builder, the system integrator, and the end user to make sure it's safe for their operators and the people to use.
So that's quite interesting. If you look at the life cycle of the purchasing equipment, or maybe let's go all the way back to manufacturing something, testing, obviously, selling it to the end user, and end user eventually puts it into operation. So if you look at the whole life cycle of purchase, supply, purchase, operation, the three sort of almost like the category of key stakeholders, you can say, that you see are the OEMs at the start. Yep. You then have integrators, as you mentioned, and the clients who actually buy and put this into operation. Yep. If you have to just tell me, in the context of these regulations, what are the responsibilities? Okay. And what are the sort of assessments expected for them to be carrying out, where you support, both on the supplier side, but also on the end user side?
So there's quite a lot of crossover, but fundamentally for the machine builder, they have to comply with the regulations, the Machinery Directive, in terms of putting CE mark on the machine. That's driven by all the standards that are available, EN, ISO, and other standards. So they have to comply with the directives to be able to put a CE mark or a UKCA mark on the machine. If that then gets integrated, the integrator has a level of responsibility for making sure that the machine is still safe in its final location in respect of its environment, and the operators are still safe in that scenario as well. The system integrator then starts to come across risk assessment and pure assessment. And then when you get down to the end user as the end user is responsible for making sure everybody that's been involved beforehand has done their bit and their machine's safe. So even the end user is responsible for making sure that the machine has a CE mark on it, it has risk assessments done on it, has pure assessments done on it. One of the services we provide to several of our bigger clients is factory acceptance tests. We spend a lot of time flying out to different machine builders in Europe and things like that, and with clients and doing the factory acceptance tests with them. So the client will do the factory acceptance test from their production perspective, and we'll do the factory acceptance test from a compliance and legal certification perspective. Usually, if that's done at that stage, it solves a hell of a lot of problems by the time you get the machine on the shop floor and getting it installed, and then finding there's issues. But there's a lot of crossover, and everybody involved in the supply chain has some level of responsibility for the overall safety of the equipment.
Okay. And when it comes to the specifying the right things to the supplier, that's something I feel we often as design consultants find gaps. That is the right thing specified. And so in our case, we'll be filling data sheets for any equipment that we are buying, where it's our responsibility to make sure we are putting the right zone if it's in the ATEX area, right gas group, right intended IP rating depending on the location and the environment the machine is going in. And I think that's where even though the declaration of conformity and the CE marking or UKCA marking is meant to comply, but also the responsibilities at that time sit with the client that they have stated everything that machinery is likely to be exposed to.
Yeah, it's one of the key things in our industry sector is the machine not being properly specified in the first place. Okay. That causes an awful lot of problems, because it might do, the machine, if you don't tell the machine builder exactly what you want it to do, and how you want it configuring, he'll build it as best as he thinks. Okay, and across Europe and across even different machine builders, they interpret the regulations and standards and directives in slightly different ways. Quite often, it's a cultural thing. So one of the things we actually help clients with is writing machinery purchase and specifications. We don't get involved in the production side of it. So if they say, I want a machine that's going to do this and make me 100 widgets an hour that look like this, that's their part of it. But what we can do is write a specification for them so that it complies with the directives, the regulations, the standards and everything like that. And they can be quite detailed. Several years ago, there was a very large company we used to work for. Their machinery purchase and specification was basically 2 sides of A4 paper.
Or email, sometimes.
Or email, or a cigarette packet. And they were getting machines delivered to site and finding they couldn't use them, because when they did a risk assessment on and a peer assessment on them, they just weren't compliant. They were unsafe. The last one we did was, and we've probably done this for 6 or 7 of our largest clients now. The last one we did for our biggest client is currently, it's just about finished, and it's currently 45 pages long. And that's a detailed specification, but that's still nothing to do with the production side of it. That's just, when you fit a light curtain, have you do this, you will provide us with the position calculations, you will use this standard, this standard, this standard, this regulation, have you considered this? And it really puts the onus on the machine builder to get it right, in terms of what the end user in the UK knows is compliant and right. We did it once a few years ago for a company up in the north of Scotland, and we wrote the document, and the engineer and director said, he says, if I give that to my 2 main suppliers of the processing machinery, he says that they're going to have nightmares. And I said, well, they're not actually. I says, because what they don't realize, they're actually doing 90% of it already. They just haven't got the bells and whistles on it. And he presented it to them, and he came back to me about 2 or 3 weeks later, and he says they were shocked when they first seen it. He says, but I told them what you said, and they read through it. And he said they realised that, yes, they are doing 90% of it already. They just needed to put a little bit more thought and a little bit more application into certain areas, which we were able to highlight. And that's one of the things we do. As I said before, we don't just look at the machine. We look at what's going on around it and what's going to affect its safety and its use and things like that. So that's it's not an expensive exercise to do from our point of view, but it saves clients an awful lot of time and grief and money once they get the machine on site and in its operational location, because it should turn up in an almost plug and play condition.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting that you mentioned that that's where you see one of the biggest gaps, where the right thing not specified to the supplier. So that leads me to the next question. You as a company, when you're helping potential clients, do most of our clients sit on the end user side or the supplier, the integrator?
Which probably, I would say probably is about a 65-35 split towards the end user at the moment. We do a lot of work for end users. We come across a lot of machine builders who are very, very good. But having said that, when we CE mark machines, I think in the last 18, 20 years I've been doing this, I've only ever once come across a machine where I've ticked every box on the list from scratch. We always find something that could be better, shall we say, as opposed to not right. So yeah, it's a useful exercise, but it can be a minefield. Some machine builders are, like I say, are really good. Some struggle to keep up with changing standards and regulations, which is entirely understandable because even in the business that we do, it's quite often tricky for the likes of us as consultants. We need to be on top of changes in regulations and standards. And that actually takes up a reasonable amount of our time occasionally to make sure we are, our guys have got the knowledge that they should have to be able to advise clients. And
so you could play that client's engineer role, and that is where we as a company, where we provide process-led design consultancy to companies. That is where specifying the right things, once what the design is the key. And because we are the designer of the process, not specifically the equipment, the packages itself, which are coming from the suppliers, this in-between thing where how things need to be mentioned, specified through data sheets, through specifications, is the key, and the right standards. Sometimes I see on the client side that, oh, this is CE mark, it's fine. Yeah. But it's as good as what you asked versus, what was supplied. So if you ask or you didn't ask for something and that wasn't really kind of taken into account when that machine got supplied, and an accident happens on site, and let's say there is an investigation, I'm maybe taking an extreme example here, would you think that HSE would like to see what did you ask for, and sort of a trail or a proof, because the suppliers will be able to demonstrate, from what I'm understanding, because the knowledge gap lies more on the end user. It's likely to be more on the end user side.
There's a couple of takeaways from what you said there. The first thing is CE mark is not a safety certificate. Yes. Absolutely.
But it is. Would you agree that it is sometimes seen as all
the time? Yeah, and that's the problem. People look at it and say, "Oh, it's got a CE mark. Yeah. I don't need to pure assess it."
And that's where I'm coming from.
You go. Yeah. That's not the case at all. A CE mark is a commercial benchmark put in place by the European Union. So everybody was building machines across Europe to a minimum standard, and the key word there is minimum, because like I said, sometimes when you look at it, I've seen black earth wire recently, so. It's meant to be green and yellow for those who don't know, but it's it's there's an awful lot of things to consider, and it's not a safety certificate. Your safety certificate comes from an end user's point of view when you've done your risk assessment on it and you've done your pure assessment on it and you're happy that it's safe. But getting the machine designed and built right in the first place is one of the key things to do. We often have conversations with people. We had a situation not so long ago where there's a specific standard for pallet wrapping machines, right? It's what you call a Type C standard, which means it's specific for pallet wrapping machines. It was written in 2011. All the other standards, general machinery safety standards, have been superseded and updated since then, and some of them several times, to be honest. But that Type C standard has never, ever been rewritten. And the problem now is that the garden standard makes certain demands on the perimeter garden. And if you have a light curtain for the in-feed and out-feed conveyor, what type of light curtain should it be? Where should the bottom beam be? Where should the top beam be? And those standards that have been updated now make different demands to the original Type C standard. But some manufacturers of pallet wrapping machines take the opinion that I've got a Type C standard, so I follow that and I'm fine. I can CE mark it. Yes, in theory you could, but it's not right, because all the other standards have changed, and the standards now demand more level of safety than what that standard from 2011 does. So that sort of comes back in before where I have some sympathy with machine builders where they struggle to keep up. We're on top of standards changing all the time. But your average machine builder doesn't have somebody dedicated to that task. And that's sometimes where they start to fall over. So when we write machinery specifications, we'll give the list of the current standards, and we say in the specification document the machine shall be built to all current applicable standards. But you still sometimes get a crossover. One standard will suggest something else, and then the other standard will say, well, if you do that, you should do this. So it's having knowledge of the standards. I mean, in our world, I defy any machinery consultant to stand up and say, I know every standard off by heart. It's not possible because there's just far too many of them. It's more knowing the key things than if you find something when you stood in front of a machine, being able to know which standard to go and get out of the filing cabinet and read through again to get it right.
Yeah. I mean, Astute and IDEA both do a lot of work in the process industry. Les, if I have to broadly kind of list the type of directives that come into the play when we are designing the system, which then sets the requirements for the machinery going into those processes, and some of the ones you mentioned earlier, machinery directive, ATEX generally, because obviously if you're in the spirit sector where there could be zones, ATEX zones for which you need to specify. Pressure equipment regulation
pressure equipment
directive comes into the play. Again, on the electrical and controls side, functional safety. Taking all these into account, do you think that clients, generally it's hard for the clients to, given how the industry is set up, to actually know and understand that what's my duty, when we are specifying these things?
Absolutely. And that's why we exist.
It's a minefield.
Both IDEA and AMC, that's why we exist. It is an absolute minefield. The amount of regulation that's out there is substantial. It's there for a reason. Some people often say to me, like, have we got to do that? Well, yes, you do have to do that, because the regulation, anything with the word regulation at the end of it, is actually law by statutory instrument. So you have to follow it. The COSH regulations, it's a legal requirement, and all that kind of thing. But it is very difficult for them. Our biggest client has got some really good people in there. And I'm actually quite impressed with the skills and knowledge of the group of engineers that they've got, because they're not all old hand engineers. I'm talking about guys who are in their mid-late 30s, and there's some really clever people there. But even they ring me up. They'll ring me up and just say, I'm not sure about this. Can you help me with this? And it's not because they're unintelligent or haven't been educated or anything like that. It's just because there's so much regulation and so much out there. There's probably, on an average machine, if you take into account ATEX and stuff like that, there's potentially a minimum of 12 directives that you would need to comply with, depending on where the machine's going and stuff like that. And when it comes to standards, there's somebody said to me a long ago, there's about 7,500 standards which can apply to an average machine. So nobody can possibly know them all. There's a bunch of 35 key ones, which our guys are pretty up to speed on, to be fair. We have one guy in the team, I'm not going to mention his name because he'll be embarrassed, but we call him the team geek. So we can actually ring him up and ask him a question, say, remind me what that says, and he just talk straight back to you and tell you, because he's almost got a photographic memory. But it's in terms of that, even within our group of consultants, we talk to each other. We'll come across a machine every now and again, and we're stood in front of it, and we'll go like, what do I do with that kind of thing? But we pick the phone up and we talk to each other. We have regular conversations and regular meetings. So we help each other out all the time. Nobody can be 100% expert in the field of machinery, but it's known as much as you can. And we deliver training courses. And one of the things I always say in a training course is, if you're not sure, ask. Yeah. Ask your colleague, get professional help, ask somebody. Don't make a decision on your own. Because if you assume something, it'll come back and bite you on the backside. I can guarantee it.
No, I think kind of leading from that point, I have worked in the energy industry, oil and gas, chemicals, both oil and gas upstream, downstream, as well as food and drinks industry. And I think the stark difference is also the availability of resources to stay on top of these things. While somebody like a big refinery or a big oil and gas giants like BP and Chivas will have very specific kind of almost like interpretation of the standards and the regulations. And when you are then specifying any equipment, anybody in the projects team or engineering team can basically put those specific standards or requirements in the and sometimes you see that increases the price of the machinery. And I'll give you a simple example, because a food and drink a client can go and ask for the same machine with standard documents, but when it's coming from from the energy industry, oil and gas giants who have obviously specific requirements, as well as the level of documentation they might expect, and that could be specific risk assessments and machinery risk assessments, and you generally see those are not included in the standard cost of the equipment that's being supplied, and your supplier will charge you more. However, if the same thing kind of comes in the food and drink industry, where they're not the right people to actually review or critique that information, then that information just collects dust.
No, you're exactly right. If you talk of the big multi-million-dollar blue chip international companies, they can afford to employ specialist people. A lot of people in even mid-sized companies, let alone small companies, they don't have the resources to employ specialists, which is where the likes of both our companies come in. So it is tricky for them. I'll give you quite a few examples if we had the time, if that scenario. But it is difficult for them, absolutely difficult.
Yeah, and that's why I think reaching out for professional help to companies like yourself, ourselves, gives them that they don't have to have full team of machinery experts or process safety experts sitting in their team. They can one year they can have a £1 million spend or capex, other year they have £50 million. How do you justify the overhead or the level of kind of competency you need? So you need to decide what do you want to keep in-house and what you want to bring in external consultants.
Definitely, in the approach we take is one of some clients who are very large companies. We don't go in there and preach. We don't go in there and say you must do this, you should do this, you have to do this, and then take the money and walk away. That's not the way we operate. The AMC was set up right from the start. We said right at the beginning, if we have 20, 25 clients who we have relationships with, they use us all the time, that's fine. That's what we want. We want to be able to partner with companies, not have 250 clients where we're just running around like headless chickens doing a quick risk assessment here, a pure assessment there. And we've actually achieved that. For the size of our business, some of the clients that we've got, when I mentioned to the people who were clients, I was actually quite surprised, because as an independent group of consultants, it's surprising, but it's because of our approach. We make the statement: we will not drop a risk assessment report on your desk, take your money and walk away. We will give you a risk assessment, and you're at liberty to ring us up, talk to us. If you want, one of the guys will come back and explain it to you and go through it with you in detail. And then we'll help your system integrator. And then when your system integrator's done there, but we'll come back and we'll pure assess it for you. We provide the complete package, and it's done on a relationship, honest, open basis. I always say to the guys, when you do an assessment, professionally, legally, you have to report what you see. But do it in such a way that you don't poke the client in the eye, because that's when it becomes a commercial arrangement as opposed to a relationship or a partnership type arrangement. And we work on an honest, open relationship basis with our clients,
So one of the assessments that you said you often hear, especially as an end user or responsibilities for the end user, is a pure assessment. You often hear about MIRA, and if then you also have risk or hazards which require you to carry out functional safety assessments. But let's focus on pure, because that is generally widely sort of adopted risk assessment. That is, and I would come to MIRA in a second. But when it comes to pure, what kind of qualification and how often would you sort of advise clients to do pure risk assessment on their assets? And
it really depends on the industry sector and the environment. But fundamentally, Pure is a legal requirement. You legally have to have a Pure assessment for all of the work equipment you own and operate. And if you have an incident and the HSE come in to see you, the first thing they'll ask you for is where's your Pure assessment and where's your risk assessment. And if you haven't got those, you're in trouble from minute one, basically, because they should be there. Pure's, if you think of Pure as a light risk assessment, that's the easiest way to describe it, but it is still law. And Pure covers a whole raft of things. From the general safety of the machinery, regulations 1 to 9 are site policies and procedures. Are your management team or your health and safety team doing the right thing? Regulations 10 to 24 are the physical machine itself. And it goes into a lot of detail. There are, a lot of people take the approach, regulations 10 to 24, so we need 14 questions to comply with Pure. In some people's minds, yeah, but that's really not suitable, because if you do that, the HSE will come in and they'll say, where's your Pure assessment? You have an accident. You'll give them a 14-page report, and they'll instantly class that as what they call unsuitable and insufficient. And they have the same approach to risk assessments that haven't been done properly either.
But is it HSE who would tell them that?
Well, if you have a reportable accident, they would arrive on your doorstep at some point, depending on how serious the accident was in this day and age, to be fair. But what a lot of people don't realise is the HSE have more powers of entry to your property than the police. The police need a search warrant, the HSE don't. They can just turn up on your doorstep and demand to be let in, and you have to let them in. We've come across instances before where the HSE inspector's been looking at some scaffolding at a site on one side of the road, and he looks over the road and sees the sort of manufacturing plant and says, I'll just go and have a look in there while I'm here. And he can just walk in and just walk around your plant and start seeing what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong. So within Pure itself, there is a requirement for competency, right? And what it actually says is the person who's responsible for deciding who's going to do the Pure assessment has to be competent enough to decide on who that person's going to be. It also demands that the person who does the Pure assessment, the physical assessment, has to be competent. So if you're looking at a machine that's got electrics, hydraulics, pneumatics on it, moving parts, with all due respect to the load of good people who get the job title health and safety advisor on the site, whilst they have some basic fundamental knowledge of health and safety, they don't have the detailed machinery safety knowledge of all the regulations and standards to be able to competently assess a machine. It's about the right person for the right job, and there is definitions of Pure assessment, of competence, and that's education, training, knowledge.
And it's not just limited to machinery. When it comes to Pure, it's not just limited to machinery.
No, it's all the work equipment on site.
The work equipment on site, and most people don't realize things like pipe work, things like they all constitute towards. So let's make it more specific. When it comes to MIRA, which is all about the machinery ignition, the sources of ignition that could be there, and is your machinery rightly specified again? How does a client know that whether it's a Pure assessment or a MIRA assessment that is more appropriate for the...
With the two different things, a Pure assessment is generically against work equipment. MIRA is more, to my mind, for an ATEX type approach kind of thing. We don't do MIRA assessments. If we get a client approaches us for a DESIR assessment or an ATEX assessment or a MIRA assessment, we have other similar companies to ourselves who we will refer them to, and we partner with them as well. So there's quite a few of them, but Pure's got quite a wide scope. And whilst it doesn't necessarily deal with ignition sources, it considers fire and explosion. A good example I can probably give to you is I once went to a factory where they were welding radiators, central heating radiators. And they had robots doing the welding, and there was sparks flying everywhere. And the robots were parked next to the walkway to the canteen, the pedestrian walkway at the canteen. There were sparks going everywhere, but the mesh garden around the robot was mesh. So the sparks were going through the garden onto the people who were walking down the walkway. Now, that garden should have been solid to contain the sparks. So Pure requires you to consider fire and explosion and ignition sources and things like that. Our Pure assessment report has 14 questions against that statement in Pure. So we go into a hell of a lot of detail. Our standard Pure report has 127 questions on it. Against regulations 1 to 24.
And I think I saw that in the presentation that you, and that's where the experience comes in,
Yeah.
the understanding of the regulation. So let's come to some of the specific machinery and assemblies where we see a lot of gaps that, identified. When it comes to the cask filling, whether these are the lines or these are the cask filling, disgorging, single cask filling equipment, you see a lot of machinery, different machinery being supplied from different OEMs coming together. And that's where the package integrators have the responsibility, and how then clients kind of adopt that and, inherit and apply the right assessments. What is your take on that?
Well, the key thing with an assembly of machinery, and it applies to any assembly machinery, if you assemble a production line, be it a cask filling disgorging line or a production line that's making cakes, for example. If you have, let's say, 6 machines making up a production line, each individual machine might have its own CE mark. But if you make them work integrally as one machine by interconnecting them in some way, and that can be as simple as putting a global e-stop on them, that series of machines becomes a single new machine in its own right. So that line then becomes what they call a complex assembly, and it has to be CE marked as a complex assembly.
And whose responsibility is that to CE mark? Because we sometimes see that integrator hasn't supplied that as a package or as an assembly CE marked.
The ultimate responsibility, not necessarily responsibility, but the onus is on the end user to make sure that either the system integrator is going to CE mark it, or they appoint one of the machine builders as the primary contractor for the line and they CE mark it. Invariably, the machine builders, none of them will take on the primary contractor role, right? Because their responsibility is, well, I don't know that machine made by them. I don't know what it's all about. Okay. The system integrators will sometimes take it on, but they're very reluctant to do it because the system integrators, they're not specialist consultants like we are, for example. So then the onus then comes back to the end user. And one of our bigger clients, they regularly install new production lines, and they'll take a section of a line out and put a new piece in. And in doing that, that invalidates the CE mark on the line if it had one in the first place. So then it has to be re-CE marked to take into account the new machine. It's known as CE mark in a complex assembly. So we always try and say to the end user, if that's our client, either ask the system integrator to do it, and if they aren't prepared to do it, look for one of the machine builders to be the primary contractor. And if they don't do it, the onus then comes back to the end user, which is where we step in and say, well, we can do it.
And again, it comes down to then end user knowing that they are supposed to ultimately,
exactly.
And if you don't specify, if you're not aware, and then you unknowingly obviously fall in the, it can lead to a lot of issues later on.
It can, because if you're breaking the law by operating a machine that doesn't have a CE mark on it, if it's a standalone machine, because it has to be certified and it has to be risk assessed and it has to be pure assessed. If you then make a production line of several machines and you don't CE mark as well, that line is effectively being operated illegally as well.
So have you held them right procedures which they can inform or educate their own sort of employees?
Yeah, we do a range of training courses. Some of them 1 day. I've just finished doing a 4-day course for one client. We can give them that information. But what we sometimes find is, I always say to the client when they want us to do a training course, is make sure you pick the right people to go on the course. And I said, I don't mean that to be disrespectful, that, I want educated people on there. That's not what it's about. It's about taking responsibility. Because if you do a risk assessment or a pure assessment, or you CE mark a machine, you have to sign that paperwork, right? And all those documents are effectively legal documents. So you need somebody who's going to come on the training course, who is prepared to be trained and then take that responsibility for signing the paperwork. Because what you write on that paperwork is what you'll be challenged against if
And
something
people
goes
come and
wrong.
go, personnel come and go.
Exactly, yeah.
And before we finish, this wonderful world of robotics and AI.
don't get me started on AI.
So yeah, what makes a implementation of robotics safe? Less, if it ever.
There are two standards for robots. They've both Part 1 and Part 2. It's EN ISO 10218. Part 1 is the requirements for the robot builder, so what he has to do when he builds his robot. And Part 2 is for the integration of a robot. So you get a robot on your site, you bolt your industrial robot to the floor, what have I got to do next? That's where Part 2 comes in. The reason why they've just been reissued and updated is because they've now, Part 2 covers collaborative robots as well. So the requirements for collaborative robot integration are in the same standard.
So what does exactly collaborative robot mean?
A collaborative robot, basically, it has limited speed and it has limited force behind its motion. And it has built-in sensors where if it was to bump into you, it would back off straight away, whereas an industrial robot would just keep going and crushing you. You know,
so it has additional safety features. What do you say?
They have additional safety features built in. Industrial robots do as well. They have what they call a software safety envelope. So if you program a robot to reach to a certain point, the manufacturer is responsible for putting the safety software envelope in the robot. So 10-15% beyond that. Is the tolerance. So it allowed to go 10-15% further than you teach it to, which might cause you a problem anyway, but then it should automatically stop. They don't always work because they're software driven. And I've seen robots where the arm has just gone to its full extent and actually broken through a perimeter guard with the trap key interlock on it, and it snapped the trap key interlock off. And trap key interlocks are extremely robust, put it that way. But on a collaborative robot, it has inbuilt monitoring. So if it reaches resistance when it's moving, it'll stop. But the key thing is the speed, and it's 250 millimeters per second. So if your collaborative robot can move at more than 250 millimeters a second, it's no longer collaborative, right? It has to be restricted to that speed. And most collaborative ones will come pre-programmed to do that anyway. So there is a crossover point where you could say, oh, I've got a collaborative robot, but then I make it go too fast. It no longer is considered collaborative because you've compromised its ability to stop moving and bounce back if it hits somebody because it's moving, more quickly towards them, kind of thing.
I guess with suppliers trying to innovate and trying to maybe integrate machine learning and AI and large language models, which obviously helps them become smarter, it always comes with kind of risk for the end user. That do they fully appreciate? What are they actually inheriting?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. AI is coming on that quickly, and collaborative robots have developed that quickly. It's as I said before, it's quite often for people like us to keep up, because manufacturers are coming out with new things all the time and stuff like that. When we specify a light curtain, for example, we won't say go and buy an Omron XYZ or a SICK 123. We'll say buy a light curtain that's a meter high, finger resolution, etc. But some of the light curtain manufacturers, SICK in particular, are coming up with some really good innovations at the minute. Sort of self-learning light curtains where you put your pallet of parts through the light curtain the first time and it remembers the shape of the pallet. They've had that for a while, and they've got some other ones coming out as well. They're not alone. There are other manufacturers out there.
But it's a challenge.
It is. But there's a hell of a lot going on. But certainly robots have come on a long way, particularly with the evolution of collaborative ones. But you still need to be very careful with them. We still come across a lot of clients who've installed collaborative robots, and then the operators who work around them are extremely nervous. So they've actually gone back and put perimeter guard around them. Not because it's necessarily unsafe, it's just to make the staff feel comfortable, because they're not used to have a robot stood next to them and they're like, what's it going to do kind of thing. They're not controlling it. It's been programmed to do something, and they can and they do sometimes go outside the program limits.
Oh, Les, thank you very much for
You're very
sharing your
welcome.
experience and insight. It was great having you with us.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Abby.